The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the overturned stagecoach, its wooden frame splintered and wheels spinning uselessly in the desert wind. Blood stained the sand around the wreckage, and the silence that followed the Apache raid was more terrifying than the war cries that had preceded it. My name is Catherine Morrison. I'm 24 years old, and until 3 hours ago, I was traveling from Tucson to Phoenix to marry a man I'd never met, a rancher named Thomas Whitmore, who had answered my advertisement for a mail-order bride. Now, as I crouched behind the overturned coach with my hands pressed against a bullet wound in my shoulder, watching the bodies of the other passengers scattered across the desert floor, I realized that my wedding dress would likely become my burial shroud. The attack had come without warning. One moment we were discussing the weather and the prospects for rain. The next moment, Apache warriors on horseback had surrounded our coach, their war paint gleaming in the afternoon sun, their rifles and bows trained on us with deadly precision. The driver and guard had tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by men who knew this desert like their own heartbeat. I had watched in horror as the other passengers, a traveling salesman named Mr. Peterson, an elderly couple heading to visit their son, and a young mother with her infant daughter, were cut down in the crossfire. Somehow, in the chaos and confusion, I had managed to crawl behind the overturned coach and hide among the scattered luggage and supplies. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they found me. The Apache warriors had taken what they wanted from the coach: weapons, food, anything of value, and had ridden away as quickly as they had appeared. But I could hear them in the distance, their voices carried on the desert wind, and I knew they were making camp nearby. They would return to search for anything they might have missed, and when they did, they would find me. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since I was a child. I prayed. "Dear God," I whispered, my voice hoarse from fear and thirst, "if you're listening, please have mercy on me. I know I haven't been the most faithful servant, but I don't want to die like this, not alone, not in this God-forsaken place. Please, if there's any kindness left in this world, send someone to help me." The prayer felt hollow in the vast emptiness of the desert, but it was all I had left. I had no water, no food, no weapon to defend myself. The bullet wound in my shoulder was bleeding steadily, and I could feel my strength ebbing away with each passing minute. As darkness began to fall, I heard the sound of approaching horses. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed myself deeper into the shadows behind the overturned coach, trying to make myself invisible. Through a gap in the splintered wood, I could see torches moving in the darkness, and I knew the Apache had returned. But something was different this time. Instead of the war cries and aggressive shouts I had heard during the attack, there was only silence. The horses moved with deliberate care, and I could hear low voices speaking in the Apache language, not the harsh commands of warriors preparing for battle, but something softer, more contemplative. One of the horses stopped directly in front of my hiding place, and I held my breath, certain that I had been discovered. Through the gap in the wood, I could see moccasin feet touching the ground as someone dismounted. The feet were larger than the others, belonging to someone tall and powerfully built. "Please," I whispered again, so quietly that I could barely hear my own voice. "Please have mercy." The footsteps moved around the coach slowly, deliberately, as if their owner was examining every detail of the scene. I could hear other voices in the distance. The rest of the war party was searching through the wreckage, looking for anything they might have missed during their initial attack. The footsteps stopped directly on the other side of the wooden panel that concealed me. I closed my eyes and waited for death, my lips moving in silent prayer. But instead of the sharp point of a spear or the cold steel of a knife, I heard something unexpected, a low, gentle sound, almost like a sigh. When I opened my eyes, I found myself staring into the face of an Apache warrior, unlike any I had ever imagined. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with strong, angular features and eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom far beyond his years. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers, and his face was painted with symbols I didn't recognize, but somehow found beautiful rather than frightening. He wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin shirt and leggings, moccasins that allowed him to move silently across the desert floor. But it was his eyes that captured my attention. Instead of the hatred and violence I expected to see, there was something else entirely: compassion, understanding, and what I could only describe as recognition. As if he had been searching for me specifically, he studied my face for a long moment, taking in my obvious fear, the blood on my dress, the desperate way I was trying to make myself small and invisible. Then, slowly and deliberately, he raised one finger to his lips in a gesture for silence. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and watched as he carefully examined my wounded shoulder. His touch was gentle, professional, like someone who had treated many injuries before. He frowned at what he saw, then looked back at my face with an expression that seemed to say, "This is serious, but not hopeless." From somewhere in his clothing, he produced a small leather pouch and began to sprinkle what looked like dried herbs onto my wound. The pain was immediate and intense, but I bit my lip to keep from crying out. He worked quickly and efficiently, using strips of cloth torn from his own shirt to bind the wound and stop the bleeding. When he finished, He sat back on his heels and studied me again. I could hear the other warriors calling to each other in the distance, their voices growing closer. He heard them too, and I saw a decision forming in his eyes. Without a word, he stood and moved to his horse, returning with a water skin and a small bundle of what looked like dried meat. He placed both items beside me, then pointed to the eastern horizon and held up 3 fingers. I understood. Wait 3 hours, then head east. Thank you, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Thank you for showing mercy. He tilted his head slightly, as if he didn't understand my words but recognized the gratitude in my voice. Then he did something that took my breath away. He placed his hand over his heart, then extended it toward me in what I somehow knew was a gesture of protection and blessing. The voices of the other warriors were getting closer now, and I could see the concern in his eyes. He stood quickly, but before he left, he did one more thing that I would remember for the rest of my life. He knelt down beside me again and gently touched my forehead with his fingertips, speaking a single word in Apache that I didn't understand but felt in my soul. Later, I would learn that the word was Ishkane. It means woman in Apache, but it's also used as a term of respect and protection. Then he was gone, melting back into the darkness as silently as he had appeared. I heard him speaking to the other warriors in their own language, his voice calm and authoritative. Whatever he told them, it worked. The search party moved away from my hiding place, their torches disappearing into the night. I waited exactly 3 hours, as he had instructed, then began my journey eastward across the desert. The water and food he had given me sustained me through the night, and by dawn, I could see smoke rising from what I hoped was a settlement or ranch. It was the town of Willow Creek, a small frontier community that existed primarily to serve the needs of local ranchers and miners. The people there took me in, treated my wounds, and listened with amazement to my story of survival. But I didn't tell them about the Apache warrior who had saved my life. Something told me that his act of mercy was meant to be a secret between us, a moment of grace in a world that seemed to have little room for understanding between our peoples. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician, examined my shoulder and declared that whoever had treated my wound had probably saved my life. The herbs used to stop the infection, he said. They're not anything I recognize. Definitely not something a white person would know about. I simply nodded and said nothing. Thomas Whitmore, my intended husband, arrived in Willow Creek 3 days later, having heard about the Stagecoach attack. He was a kind man, genuinely concerned about my welfare, but when he looked at me, I could see the questions in his eyes. How had I survived when everyone else had died? Why had the Apache spared me? I told him the same story I had told everyone else, that I had hidden behind the overturned coach and somehow escaped notice. He accepted my explanation, but I could see that he wasn't entirely convinced. Catherine, he said as we sat on the porch of the boarding house where I was recovering, I want you to know that what happened doesn't change anything between us. If you still want to go through with our arrangement, I'll be honored to make you my wife. I looked at this good, decent man who was offering me security and respectability, and I felt nothing but gratitude and a kind of distant affection. But I also felt something else, a restlessness, a sense that my life had been changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. Thomas, I said carefully, I need some time to think. What happened out there? It changed me. I'm not sure I'm the same woman who answered your advertisement. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to decide. That night, as I lay in my bed at the boarding house, I found myself thinking about the Apache warrior who had saved my life. Who was he? Why had he shown mercy to a white woman when his people and mine were at war? And why did I feel as though our encounter had been more than just a random act of kindness? I touched the spot on my forehead where his fingers had rested, and I could almost hear his voice again, speaking that single word, Ish. Somehow, I knew that our paths would cross again. In a land where violence and hatred seemed to rule, he had shown me that compassion and understanding were still possible. He had answered my prayer for mercy, not with words, but with actions that spoke louder than any language. And in saving my life, he had given me something even more precious. Hope that there might be a different way for our peoples to coexist, a way based on mutual respect rather than mutual destruction. But first, I had to find him again. I had to understand why he had risked everything to save a stranger, and I had to find a way to thank him properly for the gift of life he had given me. The desert had taken everything from me, my fellow passengers, my sense of security, my simple plans for a quiet life as a rancher's wife. But it had also given me something unexpected, a purpose, a mystery to solve, and the memory of compassionate eyes and a painted face. Will Catherine find the Apache warrior who saved her life? What dangers await her as she searches for answers in a land torn by conflict? How will her growing understanding of Apache culture change her perspective on the frontier war? Don't miss the next chapter to discover how mercy can bridge the gap between two worlds. 3 weeks had passed since the Stagecoach attack, and I had made a decision that shocked everyone in Willow Creek. I was not going to marry Thomas Whitmore. Instead, I was going to stay in the frontier town and work as a teacher for the local children, a position that had been vacant since the previous teacher had fled east after a particularly brutal Apache raid 6 months earlier. Catherine, You're making a terrible mistake, Thomas said as we stood outside the newly constructed schoolhouse. This is no place for a woman alone. The Apache raids are getting worse, and winter is coming. You'll be safe on my ranch, protected by my men. I appreciate your concern, Thomas. Truly I do, I replied, arranging the few books and supplies that the town had managed to gather for the school. But I can't marry you feeling the way I do. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. And how exactly do you feel? I paused in my work, trying to find the words to explain something I barely understood myself. I feel like I have unfinished business here, like there's something I need to understand before I can move forward with my life. Thomas studied my face with the shrewd eyes of a man who had spent years reading the intentions of both men and animals. This is about what really happened during the attack, isn't it? About how you really survived. I met his gaze steadily. I told you what happened. You told me a story, he corrected gently. But I've been fighting Apache for 15 years, Catherine. I know their ways, their tactics. They don't leave survivors by accident, and they don't miss hiding places during their searches. Someone helped you, and I think we both know who. I turned back to my books, my hands trembling slightly. Even if that were true, what difference would it make? It would make all the difference in the world, Thomas said, his voice growing urgent. Catherine, if an Apache warrior spared your life, there could be any number of reasons. Maybe he's planning to come back for you. Maybe you're part of some larger plan. Maybe he showed mercy to someone who needed it, I interrupted, finally voicing the thought that had been growing in my mind for weeks. Maybe not all Apache are the bloodthirsty savages we've been told they are. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Thomas stared at me as if I had just declared my intention to sprout wings and fly. Catherine, he said slowly, you can't possibly believe that. These people have been raiding settlements, killing families, taking captives for decades. They're at war with us, and we're at war with them, I replied. But that doesn't mean individual acts of kindness are impossible, does it? Before Thomas could respond, we were interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Jake Morrison, a grizzled veteran of numerous Indian campaigns who served as Willow Creek's primary law enforcement. Miss Morrison, he said, tipping his hat. Thomas, I hate to interrupt, but I've got some news that might interest you both. What kind of news? Thomas asked. The kind that might explain why Miss Morrison here is so all-fired, determined to stay in this dangerous place. Sheriff Morrison replied, his eyes fixed on my face. I've been talking to some of the Apache scouts who work for the army, and they've been hearing interesting stories from their people. My heart began to race, but I kept my expression neutral. What kind of stories? Stories about a young Apache warrior named Nate, that means the mischief maker in their language. He's the son of a prominent war chief, but he's been causing problems for his own people lately. What kind of problems? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The kind where he's been arguing against raids on white settlements. The kind where he's been talking about finding peaceful solutions to the conflict between our peoples. The kind where he might be inclined to show mercy to a white woman in distress. Thomas and I exchanged glances, and I could see the concern growing in his eyes. There's more, Sheriff Morrison continued. According to my sources, this Nate has been asking questions about the survivors of recent Apache attacks. Specifically, he's been asking about a white woman who was traveling alone on the Tucson Phoenix stage. What does that mean? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. It means he's looking for you, Miss Morrison. And when an Apache warrior starts looking for someone, he usually finds them. That night, as I lay in my small room above the general store, I found myself staring out the window at the desert landscape, wondering if somewhere out there, the warrior named Nate was looking back at the lights of our town. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. Over the next few days, I threw myself into my work as a teacher, trying to focus on the immediate needs of the 12 children who attended the Willow Creek School. They ranged in age from 6 to 14, and most of them had lived their entire lives on the frontier, growing up with stories of Apache raids and the constant threat of violence. But as I got to know them, I began to see something that troubled me deeply. These children, who should have been learning about literature and mathematics and history, were instead being taught to hate and fear an entire people based on the actions of a few. Their lessons were filled with stories of Apache savagery, but nothing about Apache culture, beliefs, or the reasons behind the conflict. Miss Morrison asked 10-year-old Sarah Jenkins during one of our history lessons, why do the Apache hate us so much? The question caught me off guard, and I realized that I didn't have a good answer. I don't think they hate us, Sarah. I think they're fighting to protect their way of life, just like we're fighting to protect ours. But they kill innocent people, protested 12-year-old Billy Watson. My PA says they're nothing but murderous savages. Your father has seen terrible things, I said carefully, but that doesn't mean all Apache are the same, any more than all white people are the same. The children looked at me with confusion and skepticism, and I realized that I was challenging everything they had been taught to believe. But I also realized that someone needed to plant seeds of understanding, even if they didn't take root immediately. That afternoon, as I was cleaning the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. the war cry of Apache warriors. Echoing across the desert from the direction of the Morrison Ranch, about 3 miles outside of town. Within minutes, the entire town was in an uproar. Men grabbed their rifles and formed a defensive perimeter, while women and children took shelter in the most secure buildings. Sheriff Morrison organized a rescue party to ride out to the ranch, but everyone knew that by the time they arrived, it would likely be too late. "Catherine, get inside the general store with the other women," Thomas commanded as he checked his rifle. "Lock the doors and don't come out until we give the all clear." But instead of following his orders, I found myself walking toward the edge of town. Drawn by an impulse I couldn't explain, something about this attack felt different, and I needed to understand what was happening. I had barely reached the outskirts of Willow Creek when I saw them, a group of Apache warriors on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. But instead of charging toward the town as I expected, they had stopped about a quarter mile away, as if they were waiting for something. One of the warriors separated from the group and rode slowly toward the town. As he got closer, I could see that he carried no weapons in his hands, and his posture suggested peaceful intentions rather than hostile ones. My heart began to pound as I recognized the rider. It was him, the warrior who had saved my life. Nate stopped his horse about 50 yards from where I stood and dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he did something that took my breath away. He walked toward me with his hands raised, showing that he was unarmed. Behind me, I could hear shouts from the townspeople who had spotted the approaching Apache. I heard the sound of rifles being cocked and men taking defensive positions. But I also heard Sheriff Morrison's voice, sharp and commanding. "Hold your fire. Nobody shoots unless I give the order." Nate stopped about 10 feet away from me and studied my face with those same compassionate eyes I remembered from the desert. He was even more impressive up close than I had remembered, tall and powerfully built, with an aura of quiet strength and dignity that commanded respect. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, two people from different worlds who had shared a moment of grace in the wilderness. Then he spoke, his English heavily accented but clear and precise. "You are the woman from the desert," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "And you are Nate," she nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You have learned my name." "I have learned many things since that night," I said, "but I still don't understand why you helped me." "Because you prayed for mercy," he said simply, "and because mercy is what separates us from the animals." Behind me, I could hear the murmur of confused voices. The townspeople were close enough to hear our conversation, and I knew that every word was being carefully noted. "Why are you here?" I asked. "Your people attacked the Morrison Ranch." "My people did not attack anyone," Nate said, his voice growing firm. "We came to stop an attack. White men were planning to raid our village tonight, to kill our women and children while our warriors were away hunting. We came to warn you that such an attack would bring terrible consequences." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying that someone from Willow Creek was planning to attack your village? Not someone from your town?" Nate said. "Men from the territorial capital? Soldiers and civilians who believe that the only good Apache is a dead Apache, but they plan to use your town as a staging ground for their attack. How do you know this?" "Because one of our scouts overheard them making their plans. They spoke of using the Morrison Ranch as a meeting place, of gathering weapons and supplies. They're before riding out to massacre our people." I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what this meant. The Apache attack on the Morrison Ranch had actually been an attempt to prevent a massacre of innocent Apache families. "Where are the Morrisons?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Safe," Nate said. "We took them to a secure location until the danger passes. They will be returned unharmed when the soldiers abandon their plan. And if they don't abandon their plan," Nate's expression grew grave, "then there will be war, and many innocent people on both sides will die." I looked back toward the town, where I could see the armed men waiting for any sign of hostile action. Then I looked at Nate, this Apache warrior who had risked everything to prevent a massacre, and I made a decision that would change the course of my life. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. The surprise in his eyes was quickly replaced by something that looked like respect. "You would help us, even though we are enemies?" "We don't have to be enemies," I said. "Not if there are people on both sides willing to choose understanding over hatred." For the first time since I had met him, Nate smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his entire face. "Then perhaps," he said, "there is hope for both our peoples. After all, will Catherine be able to prevent the planned massacre and broker peace between the two sides? What dangers await her as she becomes a bridge between two warring cultures? How will the townspeople react when they learn the truth about the Apache attack? Don't miss the final chapter to discover how one woman's courage can change the destiny of two peoples. The emergency town meeting that night was unlike anything Willow Creek had ever experienced. The entire population, all 43 adults, crowded into the schoolhouse, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion as they tried to make sense of what had happened that afternoon. Sheriff Morrison stood at the front of the room, his weathered face grim as he addressed the crowd. "Folks, we've got ourselves a situation here that's more complicated than anything we've dealt with before. Ms. Morrison has some information that changes everything we thought we knew about today's events." All eyes turned to me as I stood up, my heart pounding with the weight of what I was about to reveal. These people had welcomed me into their community, given me a job and a place to live. And now I was about to tell them that everything they believed about their Apache neighbors might be wrong. 3 weeks ago, I began, my voice steady despite my nervousness. "I told you all that I survived the Stagecoach attack by hiding behind the overturned coach. That wasn't the complete truth." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, and I saw Thomas Whitmore lean forward in his chair, his expression intense. "The truth is that an Apache warrior found me hiding there, wounded and dying of thirst. Instead of killing me, he treated my wounds, gave me food and water, and told me how to reach safety. He saved my life." "That's impossible," called out Jake Peterson, the town's blacksmith. "Apache don't show mercy to white folks, everyone knows that." "This one did," I said firmly. "And today, that same warrior came to Willow Creek, not to attack us, but to warn us about a planned massacre of Apache women and children." The room erupted in angry voices, with several people shouting accusations and denials. Sheriff Morrison had to fire his pistol into the air to restore order. "Let her finish," he commanded. "Miss Morrison, tell them what you told me." I took a deep breath and continued. "According to Nate's stats, the Apache warriors name a group of soldiers and civilians from the territorial capital. We're planning to use the Morrison Ranch as a staging ground for a surprise attack on an Apache village. The raid on the Morrison Ranch was actually an attempt to prevent that massacre. Where's your proof?" demanded Bill Morrison, Jake's brother and one of the town's most vocal advocates for aggressive action against the Apache. "You're asking us to take the word of a savage over our own people." "The proof," said a new voice from the back of the room, "is sitting in my jail cell right now." Everyone turned to see Deputy Marshal Frank Coleman, who had just arrived from the territorial capital with a prisoner in tow. "Deputy Marshal," Sheriff Morrison said, standing up straighter. "We weren't expecting you." "I'll bet you weren't," Coleman replied grimly, "especially since I've got Captain William Hayes of the Territorial Militia in custody for planning an unauthorized attack on a peaceful Apache village." The silence that followed was deafening. Captain Hayes was well known throughout the territory as an Indian fighter, and the idea that he was now under arrest for planning an attack was almost incomprehensible to most of the townspeople. "That's right," Coleman continued. "We've been investigating reports of unauthorized military actions against Apache settlements, and Captain Hayes was planning to use your town as a base for his operation. The Apache who came here today weren't attacking, they were trying to prevent a massacre that would have brought the full weight of Apache retaliation down on every settlement in this territory." I felt a wave of relief wash over me as Coleman's words confirmed everything Nate had told me, but I also saw the confusion and fear in the faces around me as people struggled to adjust their understanding of the situation. "So what happens now?" asked Mary Henderson, the wife of the general store owner. "Now," Coleman said, "we have an opportunity to do something that's never been done before in this territory. We have a chance to establish real communication with the Apache, to find a way to coexist peacefully instead of constantly preparing for war." "And how exactly do we do that?" Thomas asked, his voice skeptical but not hostile. "We start," I said, standing up again, "by accepting the Apache offer to return the Morrison family safely and to begin negotiations for a lasting peace." "What offer?" several people asked simultaneously. "The offer that Nate made to me this afternoon," I explained. "He's willing to serve as an intermediary between our peoples, to help establish communication and understanding. But it requires trust from both sides." "Trust?" Bill Morrison laughed bitterly. "You want us to trust the same people who've been raiding our settlements and killing our families for years?" "I want us to trust the people who risked their own lives to prevent a massacre today," I replied. "I want us to recognize that there are Apache who want peace just as much as we do." The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated, but gradually, a consensus began to emerge. The arrival of Deputy Marshal Coleman with proof of Captain Hayes' illegal plans had shaken everyone's assumptions about the situation, and my account of Nature's mercy and warning had planted seeds of possibility in minds that had been closed to such ideas. Finally, Sheriff Morrison called for a vote. "All in favor of accepting the Apache offer to negotiate through this warrior Nate, raise your hands." The result was closer than I had hoped, but decisive enough to move forward. 26 votes in favor, 17 opposed. "Motion carries," Sheriff Morrison announced. "Ms. Morrison, since you seem to be the only one here who can communicate with this Apache warrior, I'm appointing you as our official representative in these negotiations." The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a heavy cloak, but I accepted it willingly. "I'll do my best to serve both communities fairly." The next morning, I rode out to the designated meeting place, a natural amphitheater formed by red rock formations about 5 miles from town. Nate was already there, waiting with 2 other Apache warriors, and to my immense relief, the Morrison family, John Morrison, his wife Ellen, and their 3 children looked tired and frightened but unharmed. Ellen Morrison ran to me as soon as she saw me, tears streaming down her face. "Catherine, thank God you're here," she sobbed. "These people, they've been kind to us, but we've been so scared." "It's all right, Ellen," I said, holding her close. "You're safe now. They were protecting you, not holding you prisoner." I looked over at Nate, who was watching our reunion with what I was beginning to recognize as his characteristic expression of quiet compassion. "Thank you," I said to him, "for keeping them safe." "It was necessary," he replied simply. "Violence breeds violence. We chose a different path." Over the next several hours, with Nate translating between English and Apache, we began the delicate process of establishing communication between our communities. I learned that the Apache village consisted of about 60 people, mostly women, children, and elderly men, with only a dozen warriors to protect them. "We are not the raiders who have been attacking your settlements," Nate explained. "We are peaceful people who want only to live in harmony with the land and raise our children in safety." "Then who has been conducting the raids?" I asked. "Renegade bands, mostly young warriors who have lost family members to white violence and seek revenge. They do not speak for all Apache, just as Captain Hayes does not speak for all white people." The parallel was clear and troubling. Both of our peoples were being judged by the actions of their most violent members, while the majority who wanted peace remained silent and invisible. "What would it take," I asked, "for our communities to coexist peacefully?" Nate considered the question carefully before answering. "Respect," he said finally. "Respect for our right to exist, to practice our traditions, to raise our children according to our beliefs. We do not ask for your land or your possessions. We ask only to be left in peace. And in return, we offer our knowledge of this land, our skills in tracking and hunting, our willingness to serve as guides and scouts for those who travel through our territory. We offer friendship instead of enmity." It sounded almost too simple, but I was beginning to understand that the most profound solutions often were simple. The complexity came from overcoming years of mistrust and hatred on both sides. Over the following weeks, I found myself serving as more than just a translator between our communities. I became a bridge between 2 worlds, helping each side understand the other's perspective and find common ground. I learned Apache customs and traditions, discovering a rich culture built around respect for nature, family loyalty, and spiritual connection to the land. In return, I taught English to some of the Apache children and helped them understand white customs and laws. Most importantly, I worked with Nate to establish a formal peace agreement between Willow Creek and his village. The agreement included provisions for trade, mutual assistance in times of crisis, and joint patrols to prevent raids by hostile groups from either side. The signing ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, with representatives from both communities gathered. In the same Red Rock amphitheater where our first negotiations had taken place, Sheriff Morrison signed for Willow Creek, while Nate's father, Chief Coach, signed for the Apache village. But the most significant moment came when Nate approached me after the ceremony, carrying a beautifully crafted necklace made of turquoise and silver. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, placing it around my neck. "She was a woman who believed that understanding between peoples was possible. Like you, Nate," I said, feeling the weight of the necklace and the honor it represented. "I don't know what to say." "Say that you will continue to be a bridge between our worlds," he replied. "Say that you will help others see that mercy and understanding are stronger than hatred and fear." "I promise," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Months later, the peace between Willow Creek and Nature's village had become a model for other communities throughout the territory. Delegations came from as far away as Santa Fe to study our agreement and learn how it might be replicated elsewhere. I had established a school that served both Apache and white children, teaching them together and helping them see each other as friends rather than enemies. The sight of Apache and white children playing together, learning together, and growing up without the burden of inherited hatred gave me hope for the future in ways I had never imagined possible. Thomas Whitmore had eventually married a widow from Phoenix, and we remained good friends. He often told people that my decision not to marry him was the best thing that had ever happened to both of us, because it had allowed me to find my true calling as a peacemaker. As for Nate and me, our relationship had evolved into something deeper than friendship but different from romance. We were partners in the work of building understanding between our peoples, bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked me one evening as we watched the sunset from the schoolhouse steps, "giving up the life you planned to have?" "Never," I said without hesitation. That night in the desert, when I prayed for mercy, I thought I was asking to be saved from death. But what I really received was so much more. I was saved from a life of ignorance and hatred and given the chance to help create something better. And I, Nate said, learned that mercy is not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. The white woman had prayed for mercy in the desert, and the Apache warrior had answered without speaking a word. But in the months that followed, both of our peoples learned to speak the language of understanding. And in doing so, we discovered that mercy, once given, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. In a land where violence had seemed inevitable, we had chosen a different path. And in choosing mercy over vengeance, understanding over hatred, we had proven that even the deepest divisions between peoples could be bridged by those willing to see the humanity in their supposed enemies. A powerful story about how mercy can bridge the deepest divides between peoples. Like, if you believe in the power of understanding over hatred, subscribe for more inspiring stories about courage and compassion, and share to remind others that mercy, once given, has the power to transform the world. Legal notice: this story is completely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. The characters, events, and situations described are products of imagination and do not represent real facts. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.